Having survived that last video with a little bit of mathematics, which we just waved a wand at, but I hope the main concepts were clear. What I want to do in this final video on coordination dynamics is show what research territory opens up when you have established a model system and a set of formal tools, and in this case they are of course the dynamical systems tools employed. What kind of things can you look at now? Well, here's a nice example from Scott Kelso's lab. This is work done about 20 years ago, in which humans were turned into quadrupeds. Now, our legs are much longer than our arms, and we don't normally go around on all fours, and if we do, we tend to use our knees rather than our feet. We're not very good at being quadrupeds. But this chair enables quadrupedal motion. You strap the student, usually, into it, attach their limbs. You can vary the weights on the different limbs, and you can say, okay, you've never been a quadruped of this fashion before, now move. And what you find is that the movement of the limbs spontaneously organizes into one of four patterns. Shown here is the jump, the pace, the bound, and the trot. So even though this person has never experienced this particular physical mode of being before, we see the same very general, very generic principles of coordination arise, in which pairs of limbs occupy stable phase relationships with respect to each other. Those are the four logical possibilities. Furthermore, if you ask someone, if you prepare someone in one of these four states and then speed them up, the trot pattern switches spontaneously to the pace pattern, and the bound pattern switches spontaneously to the jump pattern. So once more, we're seeing these rate-induced changes in overall coordinative mode. And you can study the dynamics of the transition, look for critical fluctuations, look for the effects of asymmetries, vary weights, vary speeds. So you've got a fruitful research paradigm here into human quadruped organization. And once more, the goal is not to understand human quadrupeds. The goal is to understand coordination in the abstract. There was some motivating work from the 1960s from Russian laboratories, which was done on cats known as the mesencephalic cat. These cats were prepared by severing, essentially, the connections between the primary motor cortices and the rest of the body. That left these cats unable to walk or to move, and they were flaccid, soggy. Nonetheless, when a cat has been prepared like this, and don't do this, it's a nasty thing to do, what they found was that with a support under their belly, a cat like this can be placed on a treadmill, and the treadmill can be run at different speeds. And lo and behold, without any involvement of the cortical areas we normally associate with movement control, we find coordination emerging again. The legs spontaneously adopt relations of non-independence to each other with fixed phase relations, so we get an organized gait. And furthermore, as we speed up the treadmill, the gait reorganizes from one form to another, all without any overt cortical control. You can see this there. The bottom left-hand plot shows the relative phase. That's the collective variable. As we speed up, and you can see it's stable at 0.5 between, I'm not sure which two legs these are. And then, it's the left leg and the right leg. I don't know if they're front or back. But you can see that there's a qualitative jump as we speed up from one form of organization to the other. Now, in order to induce this, a single non-specific signal needs to be provided to the midbrain, which is very low down in the cerebral hierarchy, in order to energize the cat to raise its tone, as it were, sufficient to do this. And the gait of a cat prepared like this is not going to be anything like as good, as stable, as well-formed as the gait of an intact cat. Nonetheless, by removing the influence of the areas we often associate with motor control, we can see that these modes of coordination are entirely generic, and they emerge not from any one locus, but from the properties of the entire body under the appropriate constraints. So this was older work. It predated the work on coordination dynamics, but it was one of the kinds of questions that are floating around in the science of movement, is how can we account for these? And coordination dynamics gives us a framework within which this can be captured quite precisely and predictions made. Another thing you can do is, we said that if you're sitting on a bar stool and you're investigating the modes of flapping hands, that you'll find the two patterns, and you'll find that there's only two patterns. But could you train a third? Well, that's been done. It's been done in several laboratories since. One way to do it is to have subjects seated with visual targets, flashing lights, which give them a fixed phase relationship between the hands that is not at either 0 or 1/2. So you can shoot for a third or a quarter or something like this. And because of the way we've developed this system and the formal tools for analysis, it's possible to document this, to describe the stages of learning, the change in attractor layouts, and to probe the persistence of any organizational changes. So what you find is that people can actually keep time fairly well in the presence of an overt signal, but it takes a lot of training to be able to maintain a phase relationship other than these two fundamental phase relationships, and it fades over time. So that's opens the door now to various forms of learning of new kinds of motor skills. There was an important contribution to the coordination dynamics literature in 1990 by Schmidt, Carello and Turvey here, in which they took the basic paradigm of waving limbs, but they gave one limb to one person and the other limb to another person, and had them look at each other and had them wag their legs. And what they found was that the only way that people could maintain stable relationships between their wagging legs was at phases of 0 or 1/2. So the same two patterns emerged here across individuals. Remember what I said about one of the values, virtues, and perplexities of taking dynamical systems is that we start off agnostic with respect to the system. We're not studying a person, we're studying a prepared system, which may be two hands or maybe two legs on two different people, as it is here. Now, this work has gone many places, and one area where it's been applied to great effect is in looking at coordination among populations of neurons in the brain. And the same sort of patterns keep being found at very, very different scales. So at the level of two local neurons interacting, at the level of populations of neurons interacting, at the level of widely distributed populations of neurons as recorded by EEG, and even these days with hyperscanning where you record EEG from multiple people at the same time, we find coordination patterns emerging between people, even between brains. So this seems to suggest that what we have in our hands here is a generic theory of a specific form of coordination which occurs throughout nature, occurs in very, very many different contexts, and the tools employed are pretty much always the same. So there's a consistent strategy, shown here again, but we've been over this. At one, we try to describe the phenomenon of interest at the collective level, taking note of the existence of multiple possible stable states of the system. Then we describe the individual components and their coupling, and we show how those two descriptions fold from the high dimensional case down to the single dimensional case. There's always a bit of maths involved. One last example, because I think this one's very, very, very nice. Kelso and some colleagues obtained point light displays. So you attach point lights to your subject, in this case a person and a horse, and they recorded them as the person walked on the horse, giving time series records of multiple parts of both bodies as the horse periodically locomotes. Now, if you've ever sat on a horse, you know the damn thing moves an awful lot. And what they did here was they contrasted the phase relations between the markers on the person and the markers on the horse for two cases. One in which the rider was a novice, and one in which the rider was an expert. And they found something rather different, rather interesting. There was a clear difference in the phase relationships, and we can understand this difference in this way. The novice is distinct from the horse. The upper body of the novice is only weakly coordinated with the horse and does not exhibit strong phase relations, locked phase relationships with the horse. In the case of the expert rider, we witness fusion of these two into one strongly coupled system. So that sense one might have, that evocative sense of the horse and rider becoming one, is not an illusion. It can be documented as long as we're quite clear what we mean by horse and rider here, where we mean the phase relationships of body parts during this particular task. So that gives you a good idea of some of the directions that coordination dynamics research has gone since, and it's still a very, very active field. It's going to be our most intense case study. We will cover the next two, the olfactory bulb and collective dynamics. We'll cover them rather more briefly.